Welcome to the Recovery.com podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mala, and today I'm joined by fellow host Cliff McDonald. Hi, Cliff.
Hi, Dr. Mala. Thanks for having me here today.
Of course. Today, we're so thrilled to have Matt Lewis, founder and CEO of Rhythmental, an AI native platform enhancing mental wellness. Matt's pioneering work includes transforming mental health care for individuals and workplaces in the health and life sciences sector. With a really rich background in bringing innovative health products to market and leading advances in AI and mental wellness, Matt is here to share his insights on the future of mental health powered by AI. And we're so excited to sit down with you today, Matt. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mala. Thank you for having me. And thanks, Cliff. And thanks to the audience as well, much appreciated.
Of course. So we always start off with asking the question, what's your journey been? What led you to doing the work that you currently do? And what inspired you to focus on mental health, wellness, and recovery?
It was a somewhat circuitous journey, I might say. I don't know how many people begin their paths necessarily intending to end here. Not that it's ended by any means, but they arrive at this point. But I'll say I started really in life sciences because when I was in high school, my grandmother died of breast cancer. I was studying advanced placement biology like people do in high school. And I was really fascinated with just like cellular structure and biochemistry. And at the same time, it really hit home that it has a real impact on people's lives when cells don't function the way they're intended to. And I had this kind of naive belief that I could go to university and study and affect the cure of cancer, if you will, as a teenager. And I did go to Cornell undergrad studying molecular and cellular biology with an intention of really making an impact on the way that cancer is diagnosed and treated. But I spent enough time in the lab to know that doing bench research was not going to be in my long-term or short-term or mid-term future. It was not something that I really had much enjoyment with, actually being in the lab at 4 o'clock in the morning and being with the plates of cells. But I had just this real kind of passion for science and like really understanding how science could help improve people's lives and not just extend the quantity of people's lives, but improve the quality of their life as well. And from there, I did my master's degree in health services research and most of my doctoral degree in educational psychology. And I'm really trying to think about how do we take like large sets of data and improve the health of populations. My professional work at the time, I worked for large life sciences firms. What is now AbbVie. I was a commercial analytics lead at is what is now AbbVie for a time, really helping bring novel chemical entities, drugs, devices to market, mostly in things like women's health and gastrointestinal disease. I worked in HIV for a while. After leaving the sponsor side, I worked at Boehringer Ingelheim for a number of years in neurodegenerative disease, like Parkinson's disease, for example, and also in some other areas of neuropsychiatric conditions. I worked as a strategist and worked in digital innovation to really build software products that could help speed time to decision in the bench to bedside journey. And for the last 10, 12 years, most of my focus was on the neuropsychiatric side of things. And whether that's in treatment resistant depression or bipolar or schizophrenia or PTSD, other aspects of people that have lived experience, most of my work was working with biotech companies, drug companies, medical device firms, neurotech firms, digital therapeutics organizations, their medical leadership, their executive leadership, and trying to address what is still a very large unmet need, a large burden that exists across people with the neuropsychiatric illness, with mental illness. And my teams internally, first at what was Omnicom, and this, we're really using artificial intelligence and advanced analytics to try to get science to patients faster so that they would lead better lives and improve their quality of life. That's really where I started in this. It's not a great reality, but it is the truth that when I was at what was then AbbVie, my first mentor back at the company died by suicide. I was in my late 20s, and I remember it just like it was yesterday. And those types of things never really leave you. Unfortunately, in the 25 years I've been working in health and life sciences, I've had three close colleagues die by suicide. This initial mentor of mine when I was at AbbVie, I had a direct report die by suicide when I was at Omnicom. And then another direct report died by suicide at my most recent company. And this was probably about 5 years ago. And I later became executive lead of the business employee resource group for mental health and being at my last job. which was all the folks across the organization that have lived experience or caring for someone that does, or have a parent, a mother or father, or they're a child of bipolar, if you will, and are have their actual problems, their real struggles that they deal with every day, and they actually have to show up at work and make a living. So it's doubly difficult to manage the problems of living and then also have to collect the paycheck and do the things that people do. So I led that work internally while externally trying to bring interventions to market using AI and advanced analytics to speed the time to outcome. So that's how I got here.
What a diverse journey, and certainly a poignant one. So many of us, I'm sure, have had the experience of that loss, but to hear that, of course, is I'm sorry for your losses. And also, I'm so excited to hear about how you took those experiences and are working it through, and you're integrating it into the work that you do on a daily basis. So thank you for that and for those considerations. I know you've mentioned first, maybe we should take a moment and talk about LL Mental
Sure.
and expand into the work that whole world is and what it's hoping to do, the aspirations and what have you. And then I have some follow-up questions to that.
Sure. So the company I was at before this one is called Inizio. I joined Inizio in December of 2015. I left it in August of this past year. So I was there for almost 9 years or so. When I joined, I was executive vice president of scientific communications and publications. That's essentially all like the peer-reviewed medical publications that go out to neurologists and psychiatrists and internists and anyone that reads scientific research for literature, really, that make a decision in bench to bedside. All that work came through me, essentially. We had maybe 1,500 papers that we were publishing per year, thousands of posters at medical conferences, a lot of support for slide work with the FDA or other regulatory bodies. Anything that came out from a media or a communication standpoint was through our organization. And I had teams in Europe and in Asia and the US that kind of reported up to me. Within a year of being in role, I started what became the Advanced Analytics Group. It was called Medical Analytics and Innovation. It was me and a data scientist, and we grew it to hundreds of people using advanced analytics and AI to really get content in front of clinicians faster so that they can make better decisions and improve people's health. I got promoted from that role to Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer. The actual job title was Global Chief Artificial and Augmented Intelligence Officer, but essentially it was like AI, Chief of AI, in May of 23. And this was a time like 6 months post ChatGPT when the whole world was awash with AI and everyone wanted to do something about AI and what it meant for their business. So I got promoted from my previous role to heading AI across the organization. And I had been leveraging AI to help externally patients and professionals make better decisions, but this was different. The focus within my role was transforming our internal staff, which was maybe about 1,800 doctor level individuals, PhD, PharmD, MD staff, and other probably 750 to 2,000 people or so of other strategists and analysts and data scientists and developers to really power commercialization forward, as well as working with companies like Pfizer and the biotech firms, the digital therapeutics companies like Achille and the rest, and bring their science into the ecosystem in a way that could be value oriented, if you will. At the same time, I set up Elemental separate from my professional work as like a venture studio. It was an exploratory vision we had that there was a real opportunity in the environment, given the pace of innovation with generative artificial intelligence, to start solving a lot of the perennial problems in mental health that had gone unsolved for a long time, or where there really hadn't been a lot of impact. And a number of our kind of co-founders. Now there are 9 co-founders within the business. We had drawn up this list of like 17 challenges that exist within the space, and I'm sure they're quite familiar to you and the team. And we started to try to throw resources at those problems. And the way we did it was to try to encourage innovators in and across different spaces globally, really, to bring us their challenges and let us work together with them both financially as well as intellectually to try to solve them. And it's really ran the gamut, everything from PTSD to OCD to treatment resistant depression to anything that people were still struggling with. from really projects around stigma to zero suicide, to things that are really important for society. But I think one of the things we recognized early, and when I say early, I meant after maybe 6, 9 months of trying to do this, is that there just wasn't a lot of really robust innovation out there in the world. There were groups certainly trying to innovate, but it was isolated and set aside, often in academia, that really wasn't getting the support that it needed to really grow and scale. Or there were, individuals that had great ideas, but they were so early in the journey of maturity, if you will, that the amount of resources they would have required to actually impact the population were far beyond what we could offer. And there was really no real value to be accrued in terms of where the kind of fit and alignment with our team could have been. So we got to a point where really the end of 2023 came around, where we still had a real passion for some of these unmet needs in mental health, mental being. And we recognized that perhaps instead of supporting companies externally, Elemental would evolve to become a company of companies. And instead, we would begin building companies ourselves. And we'd essentially just focus on the highest priority needs that we saw internally. And with our co-founding team, build those companies ourselves and put them into market as we saw them to be ready and receptive, essentially. And now the business has evolved where we've spun out and have live and market. We've taken out of stealth one of those companies called Rhythmental, which is a digital platform leveraging AI to solve for serious mental illness with a focus on treatment-resistant depression. And then we're working right now on a stealth organization, which is focused on workplace well-being, or the challenges that people have in the ecosystem where they're in an environment and not getting the proper support to really prioritize their mental health as they work in high pressure corporate situations.
Jump in here a little bit. It's great to meet you, Matthew. My name's Cliff. I identify the person in long-term recovery from substance use disorder. I'm comfortable saying I'm a recovering alcoholic. I use the 12 steps primarily, and that's where that language comes from. And I'm also an entrepreneur with mixed results. And I love the sound of what you're doing. I want to ask some questions about your business.
Sure.
First of all, I have to ask you, did you go to Cornell undergrad?
I did, yeah.
When were you there?
I graduated in 2000.
Okay, you're young. I was in Ithaca a few times. I went to Dartmouth undergrad.
Oh, nice.
And I played football. And going up to Ithaca in the fall. What a beautiful place in the fall. I really enjoyed my time there.
It is really nice. And I love Cornell. I know a lot of folks that went to Cornell because I went there. And you either meet people that went to Cornell and they either love it or they hate it. I don't know a single soul that is ambivalent about Cornell. But for me, Cornell was formative, not just because it catalyzed my journey, but also a lot of my thinking in terms of what it takes to succeed.
Yeah.
And what's possible in the world is really informed by the journey experience I had at Cornell. Like when I went to Cornell, I was like fifth in my class in my high school before I went to Cornell. When I went to Cornell, every single experience I had academically and professionally was grueling and really extremely difficult. And nothing was taken for granted. But up until that point, I realized I had it pretty easy. But when I came out of Cornell, I haven't really had nearly as many rigorous experiences as I had in the 4 years I was at Cornell. Maybe my time at INSEAD would be a kind of a similar experience as my time at Cornell, but it really prepared me so well for the modern world.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And you were probably much better prepared for that educational experience than I was. I was barely top 10% of my high school class, did well in my SATs, and I was getting recruited to play football. I had a 3.7 grade point average in high school with doing very minimal work. And I had a rude awakening. And actually, Matt, it's interesting. That was one of the inflection points of my drinking behavior, that I felt for the first time ever in my life that maybe I don't belong here, number one, which is a horrible feeling. Number two, maybe I'm not that smart. And my drinking changed. It was a very heavy drinking environment. But anyway, we'd love to connect and explore that more later. And it's interesting how you refer to it. Your passion, how you became interested in the space was because of your grandmother in breast cancer. And you were like, I want to understand why this happened, why these cells don't work. One question there, you said, I naively believe You said I naively believed that perhaps I could figure out how to change this, right? Maybe I can be the one that I don't know if you were like hinting at maybe solving cancer, curing cancer,
Sure,
whatever.
sure.
I love those visions.
I can appreciate that. I think back then, like I still thought there was a discrete thing, like a single target, an entity that could actually be addressed, called breast cancer, if you will. And there
Yeah,
is no such thing. It is more heterogeneous than homogeneous. And this default tumor-based approach to cancer, which still a lot of people think is the truth, is actually very far from the truth. And it just happens to be a convenient way of describing what happens. It's really more like a syndromatic consideration than it is the way that people popularize it in the press. Almost like going into fight what you think is a single battle, and only realize you're actually fighting like a
right.
multi-country
Yeah.
war, a world war. It's actually somewhat similar within neuropsychiatric illness, within mental illness. And I talk to a lot of people in the space, as I'm sure you guys do as well. And I think most people have such a low level of mental health literacy that they don't understand really, even at the very basic level, what is at issue. And as a result, they don't know how to self manage their own mental health, first of all, or to have a conversation with a clinician about their, say, medications or their therapy or other things that are important to them. And they don't really understand how the mind works, what the mind is, how the brain works, and how it's different from the mind. And basic concepts within mental health are so poorly understood by most people within the space that it's very similar actually to my conception of molecular biology of the cell when I was 17 to the current space within mental health now. But that's not to say there isn't many corpora of fields of intelligence within psychiatry, within psychology, within data science that explain a lot of this. But most people within the environment have almost no access to it. So they're really just scrambling
Yeah.
around to put it
Yeah.
together.
I love it. And I see that connection and I see that comparison and that correlation. It makes complete sense. My life had been wonderful and I've been blessed and had tremendous success. And my progression was late. I'm in year 6 of sobriety. And I was fascinated once I turned the corner and I started to get well. That's when really became interested in the space. And I would hear things, Matt, providers boasting of treating the whole person. And this is multifaceted. Now it's like, of course you have to treat the whole person. Of course it's multifaceted. But I think the specialization has positives and negatives. And also, I think the desire and need for diagnosis. So you're in a bucket, and I think that's all connected to payers. So it's really interesting because it's never one thing. Of course it's not, right? And that's where I think we could pivot to having these big, massive analytical tools and data sets that we haven't had before. Maybe we can figure out this multifaceted thing. Every person is so unique. Is that what you guys are doing of leveraging this data and these new tools to analyze maybe that whole person a little bit better than it's ever been done before? Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I remember I heard an interview with the woman who is the czar of psychiatry in Canada. Maybe this was about 3 years ago. That's not her title, but it's something like that. And it was a fascinating discussion. And she talked a lot. She actually trained in the States, I think at Hopkins, and she now runs the psychiatry program in Canada. And she was talking about how all through her residency, fellowship, psychiatry, and she trained under the top people in the States, that she was always fascinated by the fact that psychiatrists were not only not trained to do this, but actually actively cautioned against doing this. And she was really just perplexed by the idea that when you see someone that has any brain health disorder, whether it's AUD, OUD, depression, schizophrenia, whatever it is, that they're not encouraged to have a conversation with that person's family and to have a discussion about what happens in their life beyond the clinical visit. From the time when she was a medical school student up until really running the psychiatric program in Canada, she was just perplexed that not as a social worker, but just to understand what this person, what their actual lived experience is actually like living in their brain and mind in the actual world they're in. she just couldn't understand it. And when she went to this program in Canada, most of their work is on the social emotional learning that occurs once you're diagnosed, if you will, which is really kind of anathema. It's completely controversial within the entire psychiatric movement, but it shouldn't be. Like, why should removing the body from the context be controversial when that's most of what we do? But yeah, I think that is, really critical, but it doesn't really get proper attention.
Yeah. And then to shift into your business, Elemental. So are you guys like a parent umbrella company that is almost like an incubator, maybe?
My original thought was that it was more like a holding company, but now it doesn't really hold anything. It's really just there as a front to establish the organization and to have a sense of narrative consistency for the organization itself. So the elemental vision is around augmenting mental wellness. And the idea there is that you're leveraging artificial intelligence to solve these thorny problems in mental health that have gone unsolved for too long. From a media perspective, like when I do discussions like this one, or I have a book that I'm writing right now, there are other things that are underway, they all ladder up to the Elemental umbrella. But other
Yep.
than that, Elemental doesn't trade externally. It doesn't have, partners of its own. It doesn't have any services or solutions. It's really just meant to have a consistent ethos so that the member companies, the portfolio companies, all are kind of part of the same narrative, so to speak. And these original 17 ideas that we had, most of which are still extant, are initially being implemented through the companies that are closest to market. So Rhythmental is the first of those, and then the others will follow. Like Transfermental will be close on its heels.
So with Elementals, who are you working with? Are you working with providers?
Not yet. So let me maybe I can just describe a little bit about what the two businesses are that exist within
Yeah,
the
that's awesome.
Elemental
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
organization, just that'll probably help understand where we focus. So Rhythmental is, again, trying to solve this serious mental illness challenge. We're looking at a space that really historically has focused almost entirely on symptom improvement. And if you want to think about it another way, maybe on harm reduction. In serious mental illness, especially in depression, the overarching goal for modern medicine is to help limit the ability of the sufferer, the person with lived experience, to either die by suicide to prevent that, which is essential and important. And once that has not happened, to essentially address symptoms, improve active affective intention, essentially. And really, the field stops there. If you're in a treatment resistant depression environment, you have major depressive disorder, you have bipolar depression, the space does not really have a lot of things to say about how you get from symptom improvement through to remission. It's not engineered for that discussion. There's really no guidelines around progressing someone from harm avoidance to remission. And to get to where you guys are, from remission to recovery, it happens by default, but rarely by design. It's like an afterthought. It's not an intention. It is not an aspiration. It's like a gift, but maybe 1 out of 1,000 people benefit from it, but it is not a realistic intention of the modern medicine community. So Rhythmental is entirely engineered to produce remission in people that are suffering. And once they're stable in remission for a period of time, to progress them through to recovery. It's a artificial intelligence platform in the sense that, like Netflix or Amazon or another machine learning based recommendation platform, it serves up content to them at the time that they most need it, and helps them re-scaffold their life to a life that's worth living from a life that has not been so for a long time. So in order to get into the Rhythmental platform, they have to be seeing a clinician. They have to have a DSM-5 diagnosis of depression, like major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression, or bipolar depression, and be linked through an electronic medical record that verifies that they actually are the person they say they are. If they don't have those things or say those things, they're not welcome in platform. And then once they get through that point, they are essentially customizing a hyper personalized playlist like Spotify or Pandora that is mental health driven, that gets them from a quality of life that is quite poor The average person with depression will tell you that they go to bed every night hoping they don't wake up in the morning, and they wake up every morning hoping that they die by the end of the day. And from that to thriving within a short amount of time. And our platform is free for all people with lived experience. We do not intend to charge a price for subscription to those that are engaging in the platform. At present, we don't have a direct connection through to providers. It's primarily working with the patient advocacy organizations. We have a alignment right now with NAMI. We're talking to DBSA, Mental Health America, organizations like that, as well as direct to a number of organizations that are in the patient engagement space, if you will. And I think we're certainly not averse to working with clinicians, but it's just very difficult to scale that way. So that's really the focus of the Rhythmental side of the business.
Matt, what are you calling it? Rhythmental?
Rhythmental, it's like rhythm and mental health
Oh,
together.
cool. Awesome. Okay, got it.
The reason it's called that way is first is because one of my co-founders, his name's John Nelson. He was patient one in the National Institutes of Mental Health study for deep brain stimulation for depression. The principal investigator for that study, her name Helen Mayberg, she's at Mount Sinai. She told him after they turned his DBS pacemaker on and it cured his depression after he was suicidal for 14 years, and they turned his pacemaker on, he has no suicidal thoughts at all, that his brain is now functional, but the rhythm of life still needs to be fixed by him. He still needs to get his shit together and make things work on his own. It's not, you can't fix everything with surgery. And also, really, the gamma waves of the brain are the blame, really, for most of what's wrong from a serious mental illness standpoint. It's not this dopamine hypothesis silliness that people still talk about. And it is for us about helping people engineer the right rhythm for them in their life that gets them to a happier place, that lets them live the life they want to have with their family and their friends, their neighbors and their pet and their actual mind, which they can't do if they're depressed all the time. And then to do so in a way that prioritizes their own mental health. That's what mental means. And then the other side of the business is the transfermental, which is focused on prioritizing workplace well-being. So our thesis is that a lot of folks that are working in large organizations are being asked to do a lot by their leadership, and they're under a lot of stress. And the stress leads to a lot of anxiety and a lot of concerns about their jobs that they don't really have any outlet for. And they're not really mentally ill. They don't have a diagnosed mental illness, but they are certainly not mentally well. And the level of their mental unwellness, so to speak, has a real effect on their job performance. And it's also just not a lot of fun to show up every day thinking that your job is at risk and robots are going to take your job. And there's a huge restructure topic coming where you still have a role. And then to go home every night thinking that your income is at risk and bad things are going to happen. Our focus is to help ensure that people in those roles, that their mental wellness, that their creativity, the things that make them human are really prioritized by their employers, and that they feel better about the work they're doing so that they can continue to find value both at their current role as well as whatever follows in the future, improving their mental health at work, and not just in these edge cases where someone happens to have diagnosed depression and they sign up for a Berg, which is great. They need to have those programs, but that's 3% of the workforce. The other 80% of the workforce is suffering silently, but they are suffering. So we're really focused on them and trying to do what's right by the working wounded, if you will, that are out there in a lot of pain and coming home in pain, and no one seems to really give a shit. We're trying to help them and help their employers at the same time, because no one wants 25% turnover rates within organizations, because people come home from work scared that something's going to happen and they don't know who to call because they don't feel safe telling their boss that they're anxious, they're frustrated, they're overworked.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think my other question to all of this is because it's so innovative. I heard the portion where you were saying you want to scale, so you're working with organizations. What barriers have you been facing with trying to integrate this into the systems, and resistance even?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Earlier in our trajectory, there was a fair amount of resistance, primarily because when we were still in stealth. So across the Elemental organization, there's 10 of us, 10 senior executives that have been doing this type of work health and life sciences, consulting, artificial intelligence, psychology, behavioral science, psychiatry for a whole career. So across the 10 of us, maybe 300 years of experience. And we were all in stealth for a long time. And it was a little challenging, I will say, to talk to third parties, for example, NAMI and a few others, wearing one hat, but actually passionate about the other. Very difficult. We're all very passionate people and we're transparent about what we believe in, but there's only so far that can go when you spend 60 hours a week with one job and 10 hours a week on nights and weekends doing the other. So it was very difficult up front to get alignment with groups when we couldn't really be completely honest about what our intentions were long term. As we've all peeled away from our other commitments over the last 6 months and taken the first company out of stealth, and soon the second company, Rhythmental, will be out of stealth by March. It's gotten a lot easier and the resistance has fallen away. And we've mostly had a real rush of people to us that are really passionate about what we're trying to solve for and that they're really interested to help and partner and contribute, which is great. I think on the transformental side and the business to business side, it's been really interesting because I think there are a lot of individuals and organizations that face these exact problems and they just haven't known really what to do about it. I don't think it's malicious at all. Like, I don't think there are people in these organizations that are like, we should really make it miserable for our staff. We should really make it so that every day they go home crying. I don't think people say these things are really trying to hurt people in the organizations. They just don't have a solution. In many of the cases, we've been testing out our narrative with senior leads within the organizations we focus on, which are just in health and life sciences. And it's been really positive. I think a lot of folks within these organizations have really been looking for something they can actually do that's not an employee assistance program, that's not a business employee resource group. It's not just a check the box type of exercise, but actually helps people in the here and now and is not cost prohibitive, that makes them feel like they're doing something good for their people. So it's been really interesting to watch, but check back in with me in a year and I'll tell you how it's going, because it's still early days.
It's interesting that you, like everything, there's a spectrum regarding organizations, employers, and the services they provide to their people or lack thereof of employees has really never been a part of corporate culture. That's a relatively new thing. For-profit businesses are usually driven by people that are seeking profit. And
Yep.
Miss Milton Friedman told us that the purpose of a business is to produce a profit and everything else is secondary or tertiary or way far behind that. I sponsor several men in the 12-step program, which means I'm their coach, right? Through the 12 steps. And I love that work. I have a couple of guys who are petrified that their company is going to find out that they struggled with alcohol use disorder. And because they fear
Yeah.
like they'll get fired or they'll be, put in a box or something like that. And think of the impact that has on behaviors, on relationships. I think the best companies are going to be the ones that embrace this.
Yeah.
People are our best asset. We've known that for a long time. So what are you seeing from
Yeah.
employers and organizations?
This is a great question. I think this really gets to the heart of kind of our approach, but also why I think this is the right time for our approach. I think for really as long as I've been working, which is 25 years, the idea of workplace well-being, or if you want to call it like workplace mental health, has been, oh no, I have this problem employee that has this issue, and I need to push them as far away from the core of the business as possible and deal with this so there's not liability. And I have a couple of ways I can deal with that. I can send them to a employee assistance program, and it's not my issue. Someone else is managing it. Or I can send the mental health first aid team out and then they can deal with it. And that's an arm's length thing. Or I can hire a third party like a One Mind or Mental Health America or NAMI to come in and to do some coaching. But these people have diagnosed mental illness, and then I wash my hands of it. But I completely agree. What you say is true. And I think people in leadership haven't recognized that if your worker, your leader, your manager, your department head, your division lead, your factory floor foreman is not well mentally, then the business will suffer. I don't think they've put those two things together. they still see workplace well-being like a perk, as something nice to have. Once I get through my margin and my profit statements and I pay my dividends and my shareholders, there's money left over. I'll give a little bit left over to workplace well-being. But that's actually not the case at all. For the things that matter the most for business, for example, major transformations, artificial intelligence adoption, mergers and acquisition, restructures, buying or building a business, a new product design, the most important things, the most stressful things, if the mental health of the workforce is not intact, those things are going to get seriously screwed up to the point that they won't work. They'll fail. And it just has been the case that no one's really made this point explicitly like this to people. And this is pretty much all we're doing is
Yeah.
directly equating for leadership that workplace well-being is corporate well-being. That is, that without the health mentally of your staff, the company's financial health will suffer directly. And we will show it exactly how that'll happen, the things that matter most to you. And it's your choice. Either the company will suffer, you won't meet your goals, and you'll have to fire people, or you can do well. It's up to you. It's your decision.
Yeah, I don't know what type of correlation there is between humans who are capitalists and humanists at the same time. My guess is it's pretty low. And the businesses typically have been formed by capitalists, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes self-seeking people. I have a really cool story that hopefully provides us with some hope. So I spend a lot of time in recovery. That's my work here. And even in my personal life, I get to meet a lot of people who are really thriving in recovery. I met an executive of a large financial services institution who was fortunately in a position where he was respected as a leader within that company. And he had struggled with the same thing I did. And he was very open about it with his teammates. And this company has about 5,000 people. And he said, I guarantee you, there are people in our company who are struggling in silence with something very similar to what I'm doing. He said, let me start a recovery group inside this company. And they were like, come on, no one's going to join it. What are you thinking? He's like, you might be right. But they said, sure, go ahead. We would love if people felt safe and they could have this thing that we sponsor, which makes them feel like we're providing them or helping them in some way. So within 1 year, they had 8% of their company in this recovery group. And they have a weekly meeting. And he didn't have data on the productivity of those employers or their loyalty or their tenure or whatever, but he was absolutely a smashing success. You could tell really quickly. And these people had been dying for it. Right.
Yeah.
So there is hope. Right. And I love what you're doing.
I'm not surprised by that at all. I think that's wonderful, but I'm not surprised by it at all. I think it actually comes back to your earlier comment about whether people would feel comfortable really disclosing whether or not they have an issue in the workforce, which I think is really the crux of the problem, which I think it comes down to the fact that generally speaking, there's such a low level of trust within the working environment. I've seen some horrible things in my tenure, not things that I've not been a decision maker on, but that I've been witness to that are horrific, truly, in terms of when people have disclosed mental illness status and have lost their jobs as a result and other things that are awful. But I think being able to be in a trusted, safe environment is a precursor to getting to a place of peace, whether that's recovery or progressing forward in your journey. And you can't do that if you're not trusted. One of the things that we offer from our transformental approach is that because we are essentially a third party provider of mental health services, we're not a clinician, but we are a third party provider. Employees of companies through whom we contract can share private mental health and physical health information with us that they are not legally allowed to share with their employer, and we then cannot share individualized information back to an employer that's shared with us. So if we're with an organization and they have 1,000 people in the organization, and we know that say 30% of the organization has some form of neuropsychiatric illness that is potentially going to be exacerbated by an upcoming initiative, we can't tell Cliff and Dr. Mala and John and Sue, this is going to go bad for you because of X, Y, and Z. But we can say, maybe you don't want to do this in the Pacific Northwest because there's a very high likelihood that in this region, the anxiety level is going to spike. We can't name names, but we can help shift things in a certain trajectory. And then we can encourage people on a one-on-one basis to disclose their status and seek accommodation, for example. Or we can encourage groups like the one you mentioned so people feel and get the trust from their peers they otherwise might not get. And even just having that arm's length duty of care that they're not getting now beyond the corporate endorsement is sometimes what it takes to get people on the right path.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think my next question is about future. Could you tell me what are some of the things that you're aspiring for in the immediate and long-term future? And how are you planning on navigating that? What can we look for?
Yeah, I mean, right now on the Rhythmental side, we're raising our seed to progress the current version of the platform we have to a more mature version and accrue what we call peers. These are people with experience and expertise in real situations. You might call them patients. We don't call them that, and get to hopefully 10,000 of those folks by the end of this year. So we're interested in talking to investors primarily, or anyone that has a passion for serious mental illness and for it not staying the way that it is, so that people that have suffering in their daily existence can hopefully not have it much longer. On the transcendental side, we really just building experience with health and life sciences organizations and looking at really two sides of this, which is the workplace being like a tangible asset that someone can take and keep with them, regardless of what their job, their role, or their employer is. Something that's portable, if you will. So you might be in a job today where you're a hospital administrator at an organization that's local to you. That might change in 2 years or 5 years. We want this concept of workplace wellness to not to be this ephemeral thing that goes and changes with the wind, but that someone recognizes is extremely important, perhaps the most important thing for them. And that once they realize how important it is and how valuable it is, that they prioritize it wherever they go. And then we're also looking at the same type of concept for senior staff and senior leadership, the idea of helping senior staff and leadership to think about the duty they have to the organization itself, almost thinking about if the organization goes through phases and changes as workplace wellness becomes more of a priority, what should the organization look like in the future? Almost like, how do you help the organization self actualize? You can think about it from a recovery standpoint. When you're in recovery, you're living in recovery for a while. You can think about who you are as a person and who you want to be and the life you want to lead at that point. You can imagine different possibilities. So we want to think about what that means at the corporate citizen level. So when organizations can work and live a different way, what does that mean for them, and how do they be the best version of themselves and operate in a different way? So those are the types of things we're interested in long term.
That's amazing. Absolutely wonderful to hear. Cliff, was there anything else that you wanted to ask or talk about?
Yes, but we don't have time. I would love to spend some more time with you, Matthew. I really love what you're doing. I studied psychology and I studied business, and then I did a positive psychology program, and I loved organizational behavior. And I really love what you're trying to do in the workplace. And thank you for aiming high, man, and thinking big. That's what we need to solve big problems. So I look forward to catching up more thoroughly after this program is done. And thanks for joining us today. So
Yeah,
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say just one quick little thing also, and perhaps I'm sure we'll chat again in the future, but the literature on recovery in high functioning serious mental illness is pretty sparse.
Hmm.
But what it does suggest is that there are really three major variables that predict recovery in high functioning depression.
Hmm.
One of them is having an accountability buddy, if you will, that has progressed to recovery before you, and that helps model for you what good looks like, so that you can see 6, 9, 12 months ahead where you're likely to go, and that they continue to stay on their path. They don't slip backwards and can pull you up as you progress forwards.
Hmm.
For me, that's my co-founder, John, who had this NIM study before I started on my own path. It was just like a fortuitous thing. I had been suffering for a very long time, as did he. He just happened to get enrolled in the study. He got better, and then I started getting better.
Hmm.
There are a couple other variables that are of import as well, one of which is having the ability to have a change in context and a change in routine, which
Mhm.
is the core of what we are doing with Rhythmental. And without those things, I could not have really engineered my own future.
Mhm.
And the third part is a little bit squishier, which is more on the model of psychiatry that you might favor or not, which for me, I'm like an inactive psychiatrist in this biopsychosocial, but
Mhm.
also data science
Mhm.
led view that everything is always shifting at every moment in time. And what you knew yesterday is not what you knew today.
Mhm.
And they have to be dynamic and agile and really personalized to the minute. And what might be called an ecological momentary assessment of your space.
Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
and we took those three things together, and that's what became Rhythmental.
I love it. I could go on with you. There's so much that we could explore. Thank you again for sharing that. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Recovery.com podcast. For additional information, resources, and to access treatment options, please visit our website at Recovery.com. We appreciate your listenership and are excited to have you join us on our next show coming soon.